You can hear me fine, so we'll work up here. All right, is that working now? Excellent. So now we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility for DHTML and rich internet applications. And for those of you in the room the session before, they couldn't have done a better job kind of plugging me and telling you guys what we're going to talk about today. And I also wanted just to note that this many people in the room for a talk about accessibility is just a great sign. It's great to see everybody taking it seriously and being interested and thinking about the topic. So thank you for coming. For those of you who weren't here this morning in this room, my name is Nate, and I work at Yahoo, kind of hybrid designer, developer. Work on our YUI library team, which is our open source JavaScript and DHTML Ajax framework. And everybody inside the company is now using this library, and more people outside. We're really trying to bake accessibility into it so that you kind of get it for free when you use the library. But anyways, this is basically kind of what's going on in the web right now, I think. We're moving from the browser on the left to the desktop on the right. And on the right, really rich things like iTunes and iPhoto and desktop widgets and Messenger and Word and all this rich functionality that we all just expect when we're working on the desktop. And we're starting to bring that into the browser itself. So on the right now, we've brought all that desktop functionality into Yahoo's new mail program. So this is a big shift, and with it comes some challenges. Including one, how do you design and develop something like this? We'll talk about that for a second before we even get into accessibility at all. So when we started out to build this library, try it back here. When we started out to build the library, we wanted to, instead of doing everything from scratch, we wanted to step back a little bit and look at what had come before us. If we're trying to replicate the desktop, or learn from the desktop at least, we should go back and kind of study how they went about it. So this is a diagram we kind of adopted from Alan Cooper's book, About Face 2.0, which is a great book about interface design. Really from the mid-90s, though, when it was focused on designing desktop applications. And it really has this canon, this inverted pyramid of desktop kind of interactions. At the low level are utilities, things like a character entry and mouse pointers and simple data manipulation. Those come together to combine into the widgets or compound elements. I think he called them primitives and compounds. And in our parlance, it's kind of utilities and widgets. But widgets or compounds are things like double-click or drag selection, when you start taking these primitives and putting them back together. And then once you've done that, designers can take those compounds or widgets and make those into really idioms, which bring applications to life. The ability to, what are some examples? I don't know, autocomplete, or really just all types of property-specific uses. And so as we started building our library, we kind of followed this same flow. We realized we needed to get our primitives right before we could build more complex things. So we started on the bottom with event utilities and drag and drop and connection. Started piecing those together to things like sliders and calendars and autocomplete and tree views. And then we give all those tools to our designers and have them come up with idioms and interfaces that make the most sense for their property. Property is just different sites within Yahoo. Sorry about the jargon. Anyhow, so we've really done that with our library. At the very base level, we have CSS controls that normalize the playing field. But then into the JavaScript, the DOM collection, the ability to talk to different nodes on the page. Again, drag and drop. And then up at the compound or the widget level, things like menus and windowing, tree controls and autocomplete. And our most recent widget is the tab view control. So anyway, so we started to build up like that, and it served us well. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But anyway, so just get us started with some definitions. The only thing I want to say, everybody here knows what DHTML and Ajax is. The only thing I wanted to say is that it's not a specific technology and that it's not inherently inaccessible. Everybody has this notion that JavaScript is just inaccessible. If you build things with Ajax, it's going to be completely inaccessible. And that's not really true. It all comes about, the challenges are how we implement things, not the technology itself. Rich internet applications are built with Flash, JavaScript, Java, a bunch of other things. Today we're primarily talking about JavaScript. And it's just the whole notion of bringing this richness into the browser. And then accessibility from Wikipedia is the degree to which a system is usable without modification. So in other words, how many different types of people can come to the site and still use it and still get something out of it without needing to make special accommodations. That's one way to look at it. The way I like to look at it is that accessibility is availability. We want our content, we want our services to be available to everybody. It's not this separate subset. It's just content availability for all users. And when I think when you look at it in that kind of framework, in that frame in your mind, it really isn't that high of a bar. We always want to be doing that. And making content available is pretty straightforward. It becomes a little bit more complex as the widgets become more complex. But in general, we want to make things more available, and that's pretty doable. The other thing to note, kind of stemming from this definition, is that it's really kind of a one-way street. Who wants less availability? Who wants less users? This is the way we have to be moving. It's the way the technology is moving, and so it's time to just kind of get on that train and go with the flow. So thinking back to the desktop again, the richness on the desktop kind of is accessible. So how do they do that? Why is richness on the desktop possible, but not richness in the browser? So this is in short, this is kind of how it works. The operating system talks to an API that brokers the information onto the assistive technology, whether that's a screen reader or a Braille input-output display or something else. And so the result from this is pretty much ubiquitous accessibility on the desktop. Word and Excel and even Photoshop has keyboard controls. All these tools are highly accessible on the desktop. So if they can do it there, why can't we? What are the challenges to bringing it online? The bad news, the trouble, is that only some of really the required information is passed on. If this API gathers information about the application or gathers information about the content, normalizes it into an API, a protocol that the AT can understand, we're not giving that API all the information it needs. So we're giving it some things. We're giving it base semantics. The screen readers can tell what collections of lists are, how many headers are on the page, the hierarchy of the various headers. HTML gives us that. And the basic structure of the page gives us information about basic in-out movements. So things like when the page is loading, when the load is complete, which links go to which other pages. And then some basic interaction, particularly form elements. So select boxes, and text areas, and radio buttons. These all tend to be highly accessible today. All the information about them is passed on to the assistive technology. Not everything, though. So these compound elements like tab panels, those aren't really, that information isn't available. Tab panels is an example. Like combo boxes, so like select lists, which are also tied to buttons. That richness isn't communicated. And then the Ajax, the asynchronous communication, bypasses this API and isn't made aware. The screen reader doesn't know about that type of stuff. So there's a whole bunch I should back up for a second. There's a whole bunch of types of assistive technology. Today, just to keep things simple, we're primarily talking about screen readers. But a lot of the same things we're going to put in place for them benefit other types of devices, other types of input devices and output devices. And then so the third thing that we don't really communicate today are these more complex interactions. So a drag and drop, all the different pieces of data associated with a drag and drop aren't communicated effectively. The good news, though, is that this wasn't by design. The W3C, this is basically from their mission statement, their points paper, says that it's one of their primary goals to be available to all people. And if you think about kind of the architecture of the web, this loosely coupled, kind of just marked up text, it fits that model. We can see where that came from. So some stuff's there, not all of it. They want it to be there. How do we move forward? We're going to go through four different techniques in a second, but they all kind of share these common ideas. First of all, we don't want to make it worse. And today, there's some pressure to innovate too quickly or to come back to it later, and then you kind of forget to come back to it or something. So we want to not make it worse. The second thing we want to do is we want to provide a lot of options. So some people like to interact in one way. Other people like to interact or are able to interact in another way. So we want to provide these alternative interfaces. We want to take advantage of all the existing conventions that there are. People are already familiar with using a lot of these controls on the desktop. We need to make them equally familiar with how they work in their web expression. We want to keep moving in the right direction, which is kind of tied to not making things worse. But also, we want to put things in place today that are going to take advantage of the technology that's coming to help us, which we'll look at. So the four techniques then are standards-based development, redundant interfaces, predictable ports, and what's called the aria from the W3C. This is only about 2 months old since it's been within the W3C, I think. It stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. All these slides are on my blog afterwards, and they're in the handouts, I think, already. So I'm happy to see you guys taking notes, but you can get them later if you want to. So before the W3C took on this aria stuff, it went by the name Accessible DHTML, and it was an IBM project, which we'll talk about at the end here. So on to the first one then. So today we're just going to go through these 4 pretty quick. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples. Just going to talk about a lot of the kind of the concepts in each of them. And hopefully that'll just be a starting point for you guys to do more research, more thinking later on. So we're going to shoot your hands up if you have questions, but we're going to try just to shoot through a lot of this stuff. So standards-based development is not making it worse, and it's not missing an opportunity. If you were here this morning and you saw this slide already, Web 2.0, my favorite definition of Web 2.0, all the buzzwords aside, is that it's really our chance to get it right the second time. We made a lot of mistakes in the first 10 years of web development. Most of them were forced upon us by the poor technology we had at our disposal. Browsers weren't doing what they were supposed to, and so we kind of had to hack things together. No problem. It's not really the case anymore, and so we have to kind of get it right this time around. Also, all of our budgets are back. I mean, it was pretty lean days for a while, and it still kind of is, but we need to take advantage of this kind of moment and really use this opportunity to get it right this time around. What do I mean by that? Here's a few things. One is really just use the technology as it's designed. So you guys know about standards-based development and using header tags and list items and paragraphs. That's a huge win just right off the bat. Related to that is we don't want to corrupt the different layers of the stack. So putting too much into your markup, putting presentation into your markup, or putting JavaScript and behavior into your markup or into your CSS, mixing all these different layers isn't really a good thing. So things like class equals red button, I'm tired of seeing that. href equals pound is just breaking the accessibility, breaking the availability of that link to everybody except a modern browser with JavaScript turned on. So when I'm doing code reviews at work, I just do a grep for those, and if I see those, send it back before the meeting even. Same thing with the pseudo protocol for JavaScript. You should be using event handlers to attach all these items. None of this JavaScript functionality should be in your markup document at all. And then third, to really create all these platforms. So make things that play nice with other things. People have been using the term lately, be a good net citizen or something, a good page citizen. So have things on your, build things with the idea that other people will use them in different ways. And that kind of leads to the fourth thing. We want to preserve opportunities for down the road. So put things in place now that we can take advantage of later, not close the doors on things we want to do. Stop working. So the first approach then, standards-based development, is all about building the strong foundation, about using progressive enhancement instead of graceful degradation, about starting with a strong core, building on top of that in an unobtrusive way that doesn't pollute. And one thing I like to say about markup, for better or worse, if you look on Yahoo, there's a lot of code there that's been there for 10 years. There's 10-year-old HTML all over the place, and that's when we didn't know what we were doing. So the code we're writing today, especially at a markup layer where it can be really explicit, where it can describe the content according to the specs and according to the way it should be, that markup's going to be around for another 10 years. And your JavaScript can do different things and your CSS can do different things, but as you're describing your documents, as you're describing your information, that's more or less stable. And markup is really the exact point where humans and computers kind of interact. It's us taking human words like header and list and wrapping them around content so the machine understands it and the human understands it. So the better job we do kind of embedding all that richness into the markup document, the better off everybody is. So here's a widget from our Yahoo News page. It's a tab box of a bunch of different stories from different sources. You can tab through, and if you highlight Reuters, the 6 headlines from Reuters show up, or USA Today. This is what it looks like, for all of our A-grade browsers, everybody with JavaScript, everybody using the page, kind of as designed. Here's what it looks like when you turn off CSS. Everything is still there. It's still a bullet list of sources and then a list of links with citations about where they're from. All that information is still there. If people want to, we want to make that available to them if they choose to consume it that way. Here's the same thing without JavaScript, and it's a little bit of pseudocode. I put the events kind of in line so you can see. I'm not sure if you can see them back or not, but so here, if you don't have JavaScript, there we go. It still points to that article. If you do have JavaScript, it shows a little preview when you hover over the link and some other kind of enhanced functionality. But without it, nothing's in the way of the user just navigating to that page, using links or Netscape 1 or who knows, Mosaic, anything. Just works. So we really want to embrace this simplicity, this core technology that's been around the entire life cycle of the web. So these links and lists, and then only stepping on them, coming in with unobtrusive JavaScript to make them do the things we want them to do today. Let me go back a slide for a second. Yeah, and so how many people are familiar with the micro formats and that kind of movement that's going on? It's a kind of a standardized way to mark up common data types. So, HTML is a really small language. There's only so much meaning it conveys. But we try to think about being more generous and trying to put more information in there. So here under the span, you can see the class is time date. So there's no real browser that doesn't take advantage of that today. But that kind of is what it is. And so by putting that extra meaning in there, who knows, maybe that'll help somebody out down the road. And then microformats is a more kind of established way to go about that. Here's a video capture from the Yahoo Photos. You can click through on a photo page, and it's got the rating widget everybody's used to, the hover over to click the stars, inline tag editing, inline comments, everything like that. If I go up to my off-screen web developer toolbar and turn off CSS, I think, first, all the same information is there. The photo is still down here somewhere. There it is. Underneath there are the links to do the different ratings. So if you don't have JavaScript and Ajax, you can still click that link and go do a round trip to the server to do that rating. The tagging still works. So all the information is still in the document. It's there for people who want to consume it in that way. Here's another example, or a example from games. You make your choice, and on change, it just goes off to that destination. That's great for people with JavaScript turned on. If you turn off JavaScript and reload the page, now that DHTML thing isn't happening, so you have to go hit the go button. But we're making it, works for everybody. I think we're going to look at the source here in a second, if I remember correctly. Oh, no. Yeah, so first we turned off JavaScript. Now we've got CSS turned off. Everything keeps working. And kind of here's the markup underneath, sort of pseudocode again. But you see the on change there, ready to do that if it can. But if not, there's still an action on the form. Every form should have an action no matter what you're doing in terms of JavaScript. So it still works again there. From our home page, you can do your search. Then you can click through the different tabs to do different kind of vertical searches if you want to search through images or directory or video or something like that. If you turn off JavaScript, I think all those become radio buttons. You can do it again. So the benefits of doing this are that it's the right thing to do anyway. We should be doing this anyway, just for more efficient development processes and for better web development at all. You kind of get the benefits of accessibility sort of for free. Whenever we work with the grain of the internet technology, of HTML, of CSS, of all these standards, things tend to work out a lot better. A lot of smart people put a lot of time into kind of crafting this architecture. When we fight against it, we end up kind of on a dead end. And when we work with it, you realize, oh, this is the way it should be. And oh, by the way, it's better for search engine optimization. And oh, yeah, it's more accessible now. So you start getting all these things that were designed in there in the beginning. It becomes more truly available to everybody. And having all these extra hooks in there, having these solid foundations are really the core of the foundation of kind of things to layer on top later on. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't solve every problem, as you probably guessed. And some people kind of think there's a perceived overhead. You're doing extra work. You're doing a non-JavaScript version and a JavaScript version. It turns out, kind of once you integrate this into your development process, that kind of overhead really becomes perceived, and or you realize that it was just perceived, that it wasn't true overhead. Unobtrusive JavaScript is gaining in kind of acceptance, but it's still somewhat new, so we're having to do some education with our developers to make sure that everybody's doing this all the time. So that was the first one. The second one is redundant interfaces. And what we want to do here is we want to offer flexible interaction. We want to let people use option A or option B. For example, they can do some kind of GUI manipulation, or they can enter text or characters. They can do maybe a drag and drop manipulation, or they can go to some configuration page to make that change. They can do static text entry of, for example, you're addressing an email address, or you can take advantage of autocomplete. You can use the tab key to get around, or you can use the arrow keys. Keyboard and the mouse, escape and cancel, drag and drop and multi-page. And the last one's important too, kind of Ajax kind of communication, but also having that fallback so that it can do a complete server round trip, kind of in an old school way, kind of as necessary. Here's an example of that, kind of the redundant interface. It's a graphical slider. It's a great way for a user to quickly pick from a range, a finite range. But underneath the surface there, it's really just a text input. So instead of, even if you hide it with CSS, knowing that it's still on the page gives people a way to go in and just enter a text value. Sometimes I know exactly what I want to enter. I'm not willing to pay more than $80. Other times, around here. So kind of giving users multiple ways to interact with something is important. Here's another version of the slider. Here's a slider in 2 dimensions, doing for picking colors in this case. So you can do it, you can do the sliders just like you would in Photoshop, or you can go in and enter the RGB or the HSV or the hex code. So we're giving people 4 ways to do it here. This is a classic example and probably one of the best for redundant interfaces, and one that we're all really familiar with already. A select box to choose a date to take a flight, or if you want to bring up a calendar to figure out exactly what day that Friday is for the long weekend, that's right there. This actually wasn't supposed to be a talk about YUI, but I ended up pulling in a lot of examples from there. So I guess either bonus material or apologies, however you take it. Here's another menu. One of the nice things we've done, one of the patterns we've taken in the library is to enable multiple ways to instantiate these things. So if you want to create like a hierarchical menu like this, you can either bring in a data source, like a JavaScript an array of data, and have that be transformed into a DHTML menu, or you can point it at a list at markup on the page and have it transform that. So if you already have a semantic kind of accessible, nested ordered lists or unordered lists, you can just point the menu control at that, and it'll convert it on the fly into one of these DHTML menus. So that way, it's already there. If the user turns off JavaScript, they can still navigate through those nested lists. Skip that. Not going to watch this whole video again, but here's back on the home page. We've got all these different news stories here. And as you click one of them, it shows just a snippet of that story and updates the new graphic. If you turn off JavaScript, though, underneath it takes advantage of that href and goes right to the destination. So for this snazzy, modern browser, able user, it's all right there. For people who don't have those capabilities, they can just navigate right on. Another example is here with DHTML. This whole big page slides out, listing all our services and all our different countries. If you turn off JavaScript, we have a dedicated page for that you can navigate to instead. When people think about drag and drop, it's often one of the hardest things to wonder how do you make it accessible. It seems kind of, it's fine motor skills and requires kind of sight, it would seem, at the surface. But if you look back at what's happening underneath, we're just reordering things in basically a configuration file. So if anybody's used my Yahoo anytime other than the last 6 months, you've gone to this flow here, and you've done kind of the form-based, move modules up and down, change the number of columns. So we have that there, and that's how it's represented in the database. So you're not doing extra work. I mean, that's how it already kind of is in your database schema or in your kind of wireframes. So just kind of not shielding that from users, leaving that available as a redundant choice for people is a great way to be accessible. So the benefits of these, again, are kind of obvious. It just lets everybody kind of choose what to do. We're not just talking about users of assistive technology, but all users. I'm kind of a keyboard user by choice whenever possible. And so if I can just tab to the slider and use the arrow keys to adjust the range, or tab into the input box and enter text, 9 times out of 10, I'd rather do that than using the slider. I wear glasses, but I'm not blind, so it's not because of sight. It's because just that's how I like to interact. And nothing here is really high tech. I mean, this is all just simple things, but just being kind of thorough about offering them. We still have insufficient communication, though, and that's the fourth approach we'll look at the end. And in kind of the accessibility community, there's a strong desire in general to have a unified interface. This stems from the days of kind of text-only websites where there were real worries about things not being updated at the same time. So if you have a news site and one of them's updated every second, the other's updated every hour, nobody wants to use the one that's updated every hour. And so I think where that belief comes from in the accessibility community is this desire to not be kind of a forgotten about population. But I think when you're doing it just through technology itself, working on the same data, I don't personally see that as big of a concern. And so some people raise this issue that it's not a unified experience, that we do have two interfaces. But I'm pretty much OK with that. The other aspect of having two interfaces is it seems like more development time. But like I kind of talked about there with drag and drop, all this information already kind of exists. So you kind of have to build those parameters into your database. You kind of have to build that testing interface anyway. So it actually doesn't really end up to be twice as much effort at the end of the day. So let's see. So over the last 10 years, we've done a super job kind of lowering users' expectations about what they can do online. You can't do this. You can't double click. You can't drag and drop. And they've played along. They don't really expect much online at all anymore. Which is kind of unfortunate. So when we start doing these new things, we start putting drag and drop on my Yahoo, take it in the lab, and nobody finds it. Nobody expects to be able to do that. So people don't take advantage of it. So one of the best ways to overcome that is to bring all those expectations online at once. So if we bring kind of the entire interface over, if we bring the entire model that people were used to, if we can replicate the entire desktop model in the browser kind of thoroughly, predictably, then all of a sudden there's kind of a eureka moment, and users tend to have this kind of quantum leap where now they expect to be able to do everything. So if you put drag and drop on one page and it works, and then you put it on the next page and you don't put it on the next page, now they're just guessing, and instead of having low expectations, now they're almost kind of pissed. So it's really, it feels really important, not just for accessibility, but like I said, for discoverability, for learnability, for comfort, that we be complete and thorough and predictable kind of as we bring these things over. My favorite example one of my favorite examples of this is from Photos, and apologies to people here in the morning. But so we brought the selection model over, and it's one thing to have kind of a marquee selection, but to be able to have marquee selection plus shift-click to select a range and control-click to select a non-contiguous on-off within that range is what people expect online, or sorry, on the desktop. So when you can give that to them online, all of a sudden, they're like, oh, sweet, and they know exactly what to do. If you only do part of it, then they're guessing, like I said. Another example, we're back to menu here, is we've given it full keyboard controls too. So 9 out of 10 hierarchical menus you see online are mouse-based only. Ours lets you switch between the mouse and the keyboard anytime you want. So once I've focused in this control, either through tabbing or with the mouse, I can use the mouse to move up and down, or I can use the arrow keys to move up and down the same way you could on the desktop. When you get to the bottom and hit down again, it goes over to the top just the way it does on the desktop. Right arrow takes you into the secondary menu. Left arrow or escape takes you back up to the other menu. And then you can just pick up your mouse and start doing it again. So we've taken every aspect of the way menus work on the desktop, brought them to the browser. We already did slider. Here's just a small example. Cal's floating around here somewhere. This is just from just a page from our blog. We had a developer day a while ago, and this is the schedule. So when you pull open you click on one of the titles, and you open up this detail pane, and you can click the button to close it, or you can hit escape to close it. And that's exactly the way dialogues work on the desktop. So again, we're being really faithful and predictable with the things we're choosing to bring online. I mentioned this before, this quantum leap in discoverability and comfort and expectations. It's really hard to raise expectations, and when you can get this much kind of in one fell swoop, it's hard to pass on. Some of this stuff isn't trivial, though. Baking all that keyboard control into a menu is a couple lines of code, and doing a complex marquee selection plus all the keyboard controls, like it says, isn't really always trivial. The good news is, though, that we've built all this into our library, so everybody doesn't have to kind of redo the work. And that's really been our approach at Yahoo. We've open sourced the library, but first and foremost, it's for all of our developers internally. And so instead of going out and giving this talk to every development team around the company, trying to get them on board, trying to meet with all the project managers to get this built into everybody's schedule, usability time to get all this stuff tested, we just build it into the library that everybody uses. And they just, that way it works the same everywhere, it's tested the same everywhere. And then finally, the fourth one is aria, which is accessible. Like I said, it used to be called accessible DHTML. In the last couple of months, the W3C took it and named it aria. So everything we've seen so far are kind of a progression of fairly straightforward to slightly more complex things, but really only taking advantage of keyboard, mouse, and kind of interactions at that layer. When we really want to talk to the assistive technology on the desktop through this API that exists on all operating systems, we just need to have a lot more information to tell it. If it doesn't know what type of, yes? That's an interesting point. I think in that example particularly, if you're in Microsoft Word and you have the font dialog open, you don't hit F4 to close that. So I think we have matched that instance.
Sub-windows. We're popping up a Ajax window as in that example with escape close. In their mind, it's another window.
We have had problems in general with, huge problems with discoverability, which are less worrisome. Those will come over time. But there are a lot of problems with a lot of these fine points, like how many pixels do you have to move before it becomes drag and drop, and what happens with all these keyboard commands in different languages, and how do we unify all these keyboard commands across all of our different properties without overriding the keyboard commands that are built into the browser or in the different operating systems, toggling between Apple and Mac or PC controls. And I guess I should make one other point, is we're not trying to duplicate everything. This isn't about replicating the operating system in the browser. It's about taking the things that make sense, taking the things that are efficient, taking the things that are helpful, and bringing those into the web, but still bringing them into the web. We're not trying to build Windows. We're trying to build websites, and so there always is some give and take. Any other questions? So from the press release in September, they wrote this, that assistive technology requires information about the semantics or specific portions of a document in order to present those portions in an accessible form. Markup is a pretty small language, like we've said. There's links and lists and a few other things, but not all the richness, not all the types of controls that exist that we want to build. For example, there's no markup for a tab box, or for panels, or for resizable elements, or for menus or other things. All those controls, if you're familiar with Java Swing, they exist there. If you're familiar with building things in GNOME or somewhere else, they exist. If you're familiar with any kind of Windows development, all those kind of roles exist there. And so we needed really a way to embed that information into our document in a way that can be consumed kind of upstream on the way to the screen reader. So the benefits of doing this are now, instead of having to replicate all this accessibility, we can just take advantage of what's already there. I mentioned earlier that accessibility is almost ubiquitous on the desktop. And this API already works, and this API is already what screen readers talk to. So we don't want to redo any of it. We just want to be part of that conversation. So IBM did some great work. They started this off. They started one of their research labs, and they worked with the open source Firefox to actually build in some of the things there to do a proof of concept. They got it working, and they donated it to the W3C just to kind of drive more adoption. And then they went dark for a little while, and then about 2 months ago, they came out with kind of their first draft, all these working documents. And what it does is it allows you to embed role information and state information directly into your document. Unfortunately, it was built for XHTML2 initially because it takes advantage of namespaces in XHTML. But since then, they came up with a way to allow it to work in HTML also. We still write HTML all the time. We're not moving to XHTML anytime soon, especially XHTML2. And so that was kind of the deal breaker. And so we worked with them and were able to come up with a way to do it in HTML also. So how many people are familiar with the virtual buffer concept in screen reader technology? A couple. So basically what the screen reader does, it doesn't sit on top of the browser. It's a different piece of software. So as the web page is loaded, when it finishes loading, the screen reader comes and reads that page, takes that whole DOM into the screen reader's buffer, and reprocesses it there to enable functionality common in screen readers. For example, in a screen reader, you can forget the keyboard command, and it'll tell you how many links are on the page. And another one will tell you how many headers are on the page. And then you can jump between all the headers on the page. So instead of listening to it read out every word on the page, you can jump to the 6th or 7th or 12th header or whatever it is. And it does this by having a buffer, by having its own internal understanding of the document. That's all great, but the problem is there's this disconnect then between the live document and the document that's in the screen reader's memory. So this virtual buffer handles some basic script. It handles clicks, key presses, mouse overs, some other things that have been around for a while and that they knew they needed to have capabilities for. And if you do click something, new content's exposed. If you do a key press and there's something in response or a mouse over and content changes in reaction to mouse over, that information is exposed. Unfortunately, it doesn't know anything about the on-ready state change, which is kind of at the core of Ajax. And so if something is updated in response to that method or to Ajax at all, it doesn't know anything's changed. So if you're updating the weather or the sports scores or stock or anything else you would update with Ajax, it has no way of knowing that that content changed because it's disconnected over here in the screen reader's buffer. So here's one of the diagrams from the W3C. And basically what was missing was this contract, this blue box in the middle. There was no notion in HTML of the role of different things, of what was selected, of where the caret was, of the description, of how many children something had, of whose parent something was. There's some of this in HTML, but hardly any. And so the goal then was to figure out a way to communicate all this information. They started with roles and states. Those are the most important. Here's the full list. I've highlighted a couple of the interesting ones. There's a specific role for a slider widget, for a data grid, for a tab list, for a menu, for a live region, which is something that will be periodically updating through Ajax. And so once you start to normalize these, then you can build predictive or predictable behaviors on top of each of those. Here are some of the states that have been defined so far. Which item in the menu is checked. Which link, or who's the parent of this link, or who's the parent of this menu, who controls it, who describes it. And things like, just think about a simple slider. You need to know the minimum value, you need to know the maximum value, and you need to know the current value. A desktop slider knows this, a web slider doesn't. This is the way to describe that for web sliders. So here's actually what it looks like in XHTML. You can namespace pointing at this Web Accessibility Initiative role definition. And then in the role attribute, which is a new attribute within that namespace, within your span, within your slider, you can say this is a slider, this is the current value, the minimum value, and the maximum value. So it's really as simple as that. That's all the information that the screen reader needs to be able to have full understanding and full control of these really rich DHTML widgets. Here's the same thing in HTML. Instead of sticking it in a new attribute under a new namespace, it lives within the class attribute. So after you've done all your normal classes, your foo and your bar and your anything else, then you come in and you say, this is a slider, min, max, now. One issue with this is that the order matters. Because we don't have the benefits of the description from a namespace, we actually have to put them in this exact order. So as you're doing class manipulation, with the DOM utility or something, as you're adding classes and taking classes away from your markup, you kind of have to keep in mind that these things need to be in order. But just putting those couple things in is all it takes. So this really is a way to let us kind of leverage this well understood, this established, this decade old kind of desktop API. The drawbacks, unfortunately, are that it requires newest versions of the specific screen readers. Screen readers aren't that cheap. A lot of users don't always update all the time, so this isn't going to get us to everybody. And right now it only works in Firefox 1.5 and 2. It didn't make it into IE7. Safari hasn't indicated what they're doing yet. But we've kind of teamed up engineer to engineer with a couple other kind of big content producers like us and been meeting with a lot of the browser vendors. And everybody's kind of agreeing that this is the way to go. And so I think they haven't committed publicly, but I think the next versions of all the big 4 browsers will have this stuff built in. Right now it only works in Window Eyes. It doesn't work in JAWS, the 2 most popular screen readers. But again, the more we standardize on this, the more we move ahead with this, they'll catch up. Full power requires XHTML, but you can get to the 80% rule with HTML. So all the thanks really goes to Becky Gibson and Aaron Leventhal, who are IBM employees. Aaron's also one of the committers on the Firefox project. They've done all this. They've done really great work getting this stuff off the ground. And I think really now it's up to us to help them out. All the companies that make all these screen readers are very small, kind of poorly funded companies just kind of struggling to get things going. And so if we all go off and we do a different thing, they're never going to be able to keep up. But if we can all kind of standardize on an approach like this, get behind this technology, it'll really drive adoption. It'll lower the costs for everybody to implement all this stuff. So that's why I really wanted to come here and talk about this today, is to encourage people to start thinking about this, start playing with this. And we've done a bunch of pilot studies already, and it's been really, it just works. It's really cool to see. So those are the 4 things. I wanted to leave some time for questions. I've done a good job with that. We have about 10 or 12 minutes, I guess. I talked about browser support this morning. I'm not going to do that again. Happy to talk to you guys about it. I think it's a key aspect of accessibility, just the whole notion of not withholding anybody. So one more time, it's really a win-win opportunity to really get accessible technology out there to people. Nobody's going to win. We're not competing on accessibility. It's just for the greater good. And so if we can all kind of get behind this and be aware of the developments that are going on and see if there's a way to interact with it, that'd be great. Slides will be up there later. We're still hiring. Questions? Yeah.
In regards to your redundant interfaces, alternate ways of providing accessibility without extra legwork, where's a good resource besides W3C, reading through those white papers, kind of find someone who can get a head start with this way?
So where can you go to get a look at the redundant interfaces?
Yeah, those sorts of like coding techniques that make a lot of sense.
There's some good blogs out there that cover some of this stuff. There's a website called GAWDS, GAWDS.org. I think it's the Guild of Accessible Web Designers, GAWDS. That's kind of like a clearinghouse for a lot of information about this stuff. I'd be happy to dump you a bunch of links. You can go look at my delicious under accessibility. I didn't mention it, but on a few slides I had A11Y instead of accessibility. If you're familiar with internationalization, that's often written I18N because it's an I followed by 18 consonants followed by an N. Localization is L10N. It's like L, localization, N. So we've kind of been using accessibility A11Y. But sorry, side note there. But if you the other, yeah, so there's, yeah, I think Gods is probably the place I'd recommend most. Yeah, the slides are, well, my blog is just nate.keckley.com/blog. I'll put them up there tonight. I went too far. Yeah. We'll probably point to them on the YUI blog, too, at some point. All right, well, grab me afterwards. There's probably drinks going on afterwards. I know it's late in the afternoon. If you have any more questions, I'll be up here. Otherwise, thank you for your time.